Are you a landlord wondering how the new Renters' Rights Bill will impact your ability to increase rent? With rising costs and the need to maintain profitability, understanding these changes is crucial. The Renters' Rights Bill introduces a new statutory framework, replacing many of the flexible mechanisms that landlords have traditionally relied on. While rent increases will still be permitted once the Renters' Rights Act comes into effect, the process will become more structured, transparent, and tenant-focused. So what is the current mechanism for rent increases? Currently, landlords can include clauses in the tenancy agreement that allow for automatic rent increases after the end of the fixed term. Landlords can also agree rent increases with the tenants where the agreement does not contain a rent review clause. It is only where the landlord and the tenant cannot reach an agreement and the tenancy agreement does not contain a clause allowing for automatic rent increases that a landlord can use a Section 13 notice under the Housing Act 1988 to increase the rent. Under a Section 13 notice, the landlord must give a month's notice if the rent is paid monthly and the proposed rent takes effect at the start of the rental period as the new rent, unless the tenant disputes the proposed rent and challenges it in the first-year tribunal before the rent increase date. Once the rent increase date has passed, the tenant loses the ability to challenge the rent increase and must pay the new rent. Where a tenant challenges a rent increase notice in the tribunal assesses the market rent by considering what would be reasonable for a particular property in an open and competitive market. This means that the tribunal can set a rent that is lower, higher, or the same as the proposed new rent. This presents a risk to the tenants to challenge the rent increase notice in the tribunal, especially where the proposed rent is below the market rent. So what are the changes under the Renters' Rights Bill? While landlords will still be able to raise rent once the Renters' Rights Act comes into effect, rent increases will only be allowed once per year regardless of what the tenancy agreement states. Additionally, any rent review clauses contained in the tenancy agreements will be abolished and automatic rent increases will be rendered void. Instead, all rent increases will only be initiated by the landlord serving a Section 13 notice. The amount of notice required for the rent increase will also increase to 2 months' notice before the new rent takes effect. Additionally, if a tenant believes a proposed increase is excessive, they will still be able to apply to the tribunal. However, the tribunal will only be able to award the new rent that is lower than the proposed rent or at the same amount as the proposed rent instead of a market rent that is higher than the proposed rent. Further, if a tenant challenges the increase, the new rent will not take effect until the tribunal has made its decision. Therefore, tenants will be at a much lower risk and be more encouraged to appeal the notice in the tribunal. There is a serious concern that this will result in an increase in appeals to the tribunal and cause delays and backlogs in the tribunal. Despite these new restrictions, landlords and tenants can still agree to vary their rent outside of the statutory process. However, this will only be possible where a landlord has served a Section 13 notice and the landlord and tenant agree a rent lower than the proposed rent in the notice. Any such agreement must not be used to bypass the once per year limit. This will still allow for flexibility in cases where both parties are willing to negotiate while still protecting tenants from unexpected or frequent increases. Rent increase notices are crucial for landlords in the private rented sector, and while the government recognizes this, it is introducing a clear and enforceable structure around them. Therefore, landlords will need to adapt to these changes by updating their tenancy agreements, ensuring compliance with notice requirements, and being prepared for potential tribunal involvement. If you're a landlord and concerned about these changes, then now is the time to review your agreements and the rents therein. Our team of solicitors have successfully served Section 13 notices on behalf of landlords. We have also advised individuals and organizations on the upcoming changes and the likely impact of these changes. If you have any queries regarding the proposed changes and would like specific advice and guidance, contact our expert housing team at mail@anthonygold.co.uk or on 020 7940 4060. Thank you for watching.